What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for checking into my YouTube channel. Pastor Matt here. You probably already heard about John MacArthur's bold declaration in his recent sermon that his church will be reopening despite the fairly restrictive mandates imposed upon the churches of California by Governor Newsom. I watched the sermon this Sunday, and I do have to say I found it to be rather compelling and very impressive. The sermon itself wasn't necessarily the most tightly organized piece of oratory that I've ever heard from a pulpit. It was, in fact, a rather large string of scriptures simply put together back to back. First of all, stating respect for the civil magistrate. Second of all, stating very clearly why the unbelieving world disagrees with Christianity and with the gospel. And then third, a very powerful presentation of that gospel. But nevertheless, despite the fact that it was not the most forceful piece of oratory as a piece of rhetoric, yet it seems to me that the real weight of this moment was in the whole culmination of MacArthur's multi-decade reputation as a faithful Bible preaching expositor, taking a stand against what would seem to be the overreach of the state. That was very impressive in the moment. Now, I certainly don't want to get, in this video at least, into long drawn-out discussions about masks and singing in churches and things like that and the spread of the virus. We can debate all those on another day. However, like many other Christians, I do feel that the state, and especially in California, other states respectively as well, has gone dangerously far in telling the church what it ought to and what it ought not to be able to do as the church. Of course, the great irony in all this is that the restrictions on churches are far more severe than they are on very many other aspects of civil and commercial life. And I think that's one of MacArthur's great points, is that you've got places like abortion facilities, you have places that sell alcohol, you have casinos, places that sell weed or pot. All of these places have less restrictions than the church, and then even to the point of mandating that churches are forbidden to sing as a congregation seems to me to be a gross overreach and overstep of the civil magistrate into the affairs of the church. Now, I'm a Presbyterian, so we confess the Westminster Confession of Faith, and we have in our confession chapter 23, which is a fairly robust statement on the divine parameters of the civil magistrate. But nevertheless, we read this in 23:3: civil magistrates may not assume to themselves the administration of the word and sacraments, or the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven, or in the least interfere in matters of faith. And then it goes on to say that the magistrate actually exists for the protection of the church itself. So as I watched MacArthur preach, I couldn't help but feel that MacArthur is to our day what Solomon Stoddard might have been to the churches of the colonies, a stalwart, faithful man who yet nevertheless had several controversies during his life. Solomon Stoddard had many, MacArthur has many as well, and yet nevertheless the elder statesman, the spokesperson, the wizened counsel, the person of conviction and boldness, unafraid to speak up in the moment. That was Solomon Stoddard, and that was John MacArthur to evangelical churches on this past Lord's Day. Now, as far as MacArthur himself, I greatly respect him as a commentator, as a preacher, to some extent as a theologian. Of course, I have differences with him as a Presbyterian. And yet it seems like in every step, MacArthur was the man who had the courage to say what needed to be said in the moment. So whether it was the charismatic excesses and the Strange Fire Conference, or to some of our chagrin, when he told us that every self-respecting Calvinist ought to be premillennial, and we all kind of looked at ourselves like, are any Calvinists premillennial? Like that Venn diagram, the overlap is pretty small. But even there, even in the differences between us in practicing infant baptism and him as a credo Baptist, and he said some pretty tough things about us infant Baptists, no doubt about that, you have to admire the courage of the person who's willing to say the hard thing in that moment, and that has been to a great extent, John MacArthur. I remember when I was a Bible student at Malone College, driving half an hour back and forth to school, listening to great men like R.C. Sproul preaching on the radio, and certainly John MacArthur's Grace to You. Sproul taught me theology in his Renewing Your Mind program. MacArthur taught me how to preach verse by verse expository in his Grace to You program. So even though I have some disagreements with MacArthur, I have to respect him as the bold man of God, a gospel man, a faithful man, willing to stand for truth. Well, that's it today. Thank you so much for checking into this YouTube video. Feel free to comment, agree, or disagree in the comments below. As always, I love you a lot, and we'll check you later.